Okay, hello and welcome everyone. So this video is going to be a walkthrough of some key concepts in microeconomics. And so I'll talk about these 13 concepts: concept of highest value use, opportunity cost, marginal analysis, supply and demand analysis, elasticity, markup rule, shutdown decision analysis, break-even decision analysis, components of cost, fixed, variable, avoidable, unavoidable, characteristics, differences and implications of the four market structures, behavioral economics, price discrimination, and transfer pricing. So the concept of the highest value use is the idea that, well, because of scarcity, we've got to make careful choices about the use of resources. And each resource has numerous possible potential uses, but they vary in terms of the value that there's going to possibly be created. So the idea is economic activity generates economic value, and we can maximize efficiency. We can maximize the value created by the use of the products by sending, or use of the inputs by sending them into their highest value use. So you think of like the water resource. Are you better off using that water for agricultural uses or for a fountain at a casino, right? So there's this trade-off that's faced in the desert Southwest all the time, is like, how should we use the water resource? What's the highest value use? Well, to be able to measure this, you have to think of like, what's the value of the water being used on the land for agricultural uses, in particular for the final goods that are being produced there, and what's the value of the contribution of the fountains and the services provided by whatever is the institution or casino or whatever that's using the water. The main idea, the central idea, is that buyers vary according to their maximal willingness to pay. And ultimately what we want to do is we want to direct resources towards those willing to pay the most for them, because we're assuming that whoever values it the most is going to pay the most for them, because why would you pay a lot for something you didn't value very highly? Because then the actual surplus you walk away with is the difference between how much you've actually paid and then what was your willingness to pay. And so you want your maximal valuation to be higher than what you're actually paying. So presumably those with higher valuations are willing to pay more. And so anyway, so we're taking this as a signal of where the resources are most valued in the economy. Now, failing to do this, failing to direct resources towards the those with the highest valuation, is going to lead to inefficiency, and it's going to lead to us incurring opportunity cost. For instance, the foregone ability to receive the greater economic gains from the alternative use of the resource, right? If you use the water for one use, you can't possibly use it for something else. Or at least you can't use that same instantiation of the resource for the other use. And so you forego the ability to use that resource for the other purpose. All right, opportunity cost. Opportunity cost refers to what's given up or foregone, what's sacrificed when choosing to use one activity rather than for one resource for its activity rather than its alternative. So the opportunity cost of a resource is the next best alternative use. I've got a video on opportunity cost, like 2 minutes, but basically the idea is opportunity cost is what's given up or what's sacrificed. So lots of times people want to think of, like, they see opportunity and they're like, oh, the opportunity cost means like what I am able to give up or what I'm able to do or something like this. So let's think about like the example of going to the movie theater. So if you're thinking about opportunity cost, sometimes the misunderstanding is people say, oh, well, because I've gone to the movie theater, I've got the opportunity to go. The opportunity cost is now I get to buy soda and popcorn and so on and so forth. No, that's not what the opportunity cost is. The opportunity cost is the foregone ability to use your resources for other things. It's what you give up or sacrifice. So in the movie theater example, the opportunity cost is the foregone ability to use your time for something else. And so it's the value of your time spent watching the movie versus the value of your time spent working or with family or other friends or whatever is the case. Also, if you buy soda or if you buy popcorn at the movie theater, the opportunity cost is not that you're getting to buy those things, it's the lost ability to use that money for something else, right? And so if you spend $20 on a soda or soda and popcorn at the movie theater, the opportunity cost is the foregone ability to spend those $20 on something else, right? Okay, so marginal analysis, this is used to determine profit maximizing production. So you want to think of like MR equals MC, marginal revenue versus marginal cost. Marginal analysis is just optimization. It's basically we want to think of what's the positive contribution of one additional incremental unit of activity versus what's the cost of one additional incremental unit of the activity. So you want to compare the marginal revenue, the benefit from one more unit of output being sold, to its marginal cost, the cost of producing one more unit of output, right? So it's an incremental comparison. If the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost, do more. So if MR is bigger than MC, produce more. If the marginal benefit is less than the marginal cost, so if the marginal revenue is below the marginal cost, produce less. And if the marginal revenue equals marginal cost, if the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost, you're already optimizing. You should just maintain whatever you're doing. All right, so supply and demand analysis. You want to think about moving the curves, understand why there's an upward or downward slope, and then what shifts. Okay, so you'd shift the supply or demand curve left or to the right if something other than price changes. If the price of the good changes, you could only get a change in quantity demanded or quantity supplied, right? So quantity demanded is the amount consumers want to buy at a given price. So if that price changes, the amount they want to buy changes. That's not a shift. It's a movement along a curve. If the price changes, the amount sellers are willing and able to bring to the market changes. So if the price changes, the quantity supplied changes. That's a movement up or down the supply curve, not a shift. If something other than price changes, now you can get a shift. And so you want to think about like listing our determinants of supply and demand, or demand and supply factors, the things that could change and could actually shift the curve. So for like just real quick, for demand, it's like a change in the number of buyers, change in the prices of related goods or services, be they substitutes or complements, changes in the expected future price. What's changing isn't the price, it's your belief about the price. Change in consumer tastes and preferences. For supply, it'd be like a change in the number of firms, change in expected future prices, change in the prices of related goods or services the firm could also be producing, change in important input prices, change in technology, right? So those are things that'll shift the curve. Why is it upward or downward sloping? Okay, so the demand curve slopes downward by the law of demand. So at higher prices, consumers want to buy a smaller quantity. So quantity demanded is smaller at higher prices, and at lower prices, consumers want to buy a larger quantity. And then for suppliers at higher prices, suppliers are willing to bring more to the market. So supply curve slopes upward. What shifts? I just kind of talked about that. So like I said in my comment, the key to supply and demand analysis is realizing the difference between a change in demand versus a change in quantity demanded. Similarly for supply versus a change in quantity supplied. If prices change, only quantity changes. For demand or supply to change, you need something other than price to change. If you have both curves moving, then you have to draw two pictures. If you have something that's going to be a shock to the market, I say one cause for one effect, right? So you want to, in a given example, you want to identify what's changing as either being a demand side effect or a supply side shift, or a supply side effect. You don't want, so if the example would be like, we have a drought in the Southwest, and this is affecting the production of avocados. What you want to do is you want to identify that as a change in the amount that can be produced at all possible prices, a leftward shift in the supply of avocados. Then you would not say anything about demand. There's a tendency for students to want to say, oh, we had this drought. This is going to leftward shift the supply of avocados, and so this is going to like do something to demand. No, one cause for one effect. And so here we said the drought is affecting the supply side, shift supply to the left, don't say anything about demand. Now, technically, what's the effect on the demand side? Well, think about it. We've leftward shifted the supply curve. I don't know if I could do it for the video. Leftward shift supply leads to a higher price. Higher price leads to a lower quantity demanded. So the effect on the other side, so if you have a shift for supply, you'll get a change in price and a change in quantity demanded. If you get a shift for demand, you'll get a change in price and a change in quantity supplied. That's how they link together. The other thing is I've got another video where I talk about using the supply and demand model. You could do this to make predictions. I want to talk about that just real quick, especially as I'm talking about like how we'd actually use this thing. So the supply and demand model in itself is just kind of a way to organize our thinking, but you can actually use just the basic like Econ 101 supply and demand model to make predictions. So for instance, During the pandemic, we see this rise in people wanting to buy paper towels, right? Paper towel prices spiked on Amazon. Matter of fact, in a lot of places you couldn't find them. They're sold off the shelves, right? So we definitely know there's an increase in demand, right? So there's an increase in demand for paper towels. That's a rightward shift of the demand curve. We also know there is a decrease in supply, right? Factories kind of shut down. It was hard to be able to produce because of social distancing orders, and there's like supply chain trucks weren't running in some cases, and so it was difficult to stock the shelves. So there's an increase in demand, decrease in supply. The increase in demand is a recipe for a higher price. Like draw it, like just draw like the rightward shift of demand. You'll see it crosses at a higher price and a higher quantity. Price is always on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal. Now draw a separate picture with a leftward shift of supply. You'll get a higher price and a lower quantity. All right, so both are a recipe for an increase in price, right? And then if the demand shifted, we get an increase in quantity. If supply shifted, we get a decrease in quantity, right? And both of these happened at the same time. But what economists might want to do is say, how can we characterize this situation? Of course, we know both demand increased and supply decreased. We know the price rose. We want to know which had the stronger effect on the market, because this is important for our forecasting. All right, well, what you can do is you can look at what happened to the quantity. So the question you want to ask is, were more paper towels bought and sold in the months after the recession than the previous year, right? So if more paper towels were bought and sold, we say, yeah, the price rose and the quantity rose. It must have been predominantly a demand side effect on the market. But if we see the price rose and the quantity of paper towels bought and sold actually fell, we'd say even though we had this big increase in demand, we know that we must have had a larger decrease in supply because the quantity would have had fallen. That can only happen with a leftward shift of supply. Anyway, so I've got another video. I've got two of them actually. It's called Using the Supply and Demand Model. It's basically walking through an example just like that with the graphs. All right, so elasticity. I've got another video called All About Elasticity that I recommend. So we have demand, price elasticity of demand, price elasticity of supply, income elasticity, and cross-price elasticity. So what variables make more elastic and more inelastic? Knowing how to use both the midpoint equation and the percentage equation. The percentage equation is just literally applying the definition. So price elasticity of demand is a percentage change in quantity divided by a percentage change in price. If we say that the price of gas rose by 10% and the quantity demanded of gas fell by 50%, you divide minus 50 divided by positive 10 would be minus 5. And then the price elasticity of demand would be minus 5. That would be ridiculous for gas because we'd expect gas is going to be actually pretty inelastic. But anyway, that's just an example. Real quick. The midpoint equation is going to take the change in quantity divided by its average and then divide that by the change in price divided by its average. So I've got two videos. I've got one that's just called like the elasticity midpoint formula. So you just go to the channel, type in midpoint formula, and you'll come to that video. Or my All About Elasticity video talks like verbally about the midpoint equation. Basically, it's the new quantity minus the old quantity divided by the average quantity. And then the whole thing is then divided by new price minus old price divided by average price. And yeah. You look at the midpoint formula, it's like Q2 minus Q1 divided by the quantity of Q1 plus Q2 divided by 2. And then the whole thing is P2 minus P1 divided by P1 plus P2 over 2, and that's just horrible to look at. So what is it? The P1 plus P2 divided by 2, it's just the average price. So just think about it in terms of the average, right? That's how you remember it. It's like the change in quantity divided by the average quantity. That whole thing is then divided by the change in price divided by the average price. And just think about it that way rather than these P1s and P2s, which nobody would ever remember except me. So, all right, let's see. So what's the point of elasticity? We already know by the law of demand, when price rises, quantity falls, and vice versa, right? If price changes, quantity is going to change. The question is, does it change a lot or a little, right? We want to measure how responsive price is to change, or quantity is to changes in price. So elastic means responsive, inelastic means unresponsive. So it's the percentage change in quantity divided by the percentage change in price, and the midpoint is just the average change in quantity divided by, it's it was right the way that I said it. So it's the change in quantity divided by the average quantity, and then the change in price divided by the average price. All right, so markup rule. So the markup rule is price minus marginal cost divided by price. So this is markup is price minus marginal cost. That's the contribution margin divided by its price tells us what percentage of the price is the markup. And then you set this equal to 1 over the price elasticity of demand. And just looking at this rule, this is telling us, suppose we have perfect competition. So price equals marginal cost. So you get a 0 here. How do you get a 0? Well, I kind of can't get that, but it's like if you have infinite elasticity, like 1 over infinity, 1 over a really large number. Of course, it's undefined, right? Fine. But like think about increasingly larger denominators, 1 over 2, 1 over 3, 1 over 4, 1 over 100, 1 over a million, that tends towards 0, right? So as we get a larger elasticity, more elastic demand, we get a smaller markup. If we get a smaller elasticity, more inelastic demand, think about increasingly small elasticities. So like 1 over 1/2 is 2, 1 over 1/3 is 3, 1 over 1/10 is 10, 1 over 1/1,000,000th is 1 million, right? The more inelastic is the elasticity, the larger is the markup. Right? So that's the idea. When markup is high, demand must be inelastic. And then what's relevant are the avoidable costs. Unavoidable costs are irrelevant for shutdown as they're considered sunk. Why did this get thrown in here? I just read this because I'm just reading it. I don't know, whatever. So, maybe I threw this down here. I guess, fine, this belongs down here. I'm not going to edit that out because I'm not going to do that. But the other thing you can get from the markup rule is this is actually a consequence of our profit maximization equation. And one thing we can see is, well, the monopoly is actually, the markup rule is really only useful if elasticity is unit elastic or elastic. It's not useful where demand is inelastic or the inelastic portion of the demand curve. And the way that you need to see that real quick is over the portion of the demand curve where demand is inelastic, that is like below the midpoint, that corresponds to a place where the marginal revenue has fallen below the quantity axis, and therefore marginal revenue is negative. So a firm with market power never wants to produce in price over the inelastic portion of the demand curve. So you'd only use the markup rule over the elastic portion of the demand curve. Okay. Shutdown analysis. What costs are relevant, what is not relevant? Oh, I said this already. What's relevant are the avoidable costs. Unavoidable costs are irrelevant for shutdown as they're considered sunk. For shutdown analysis, we're comparing price to average variable cost. If price is bigger than average variable cost, we keep producing. If price is less than average variable cost, we shut down. So basically here what we want to think about is shutdown is a short-run decision. Our fixed costs are already sunk. We've already paid our rent for our location. Maybe you've got like a kiosk on the beach and you had to pay to rent that spot and you're trying to sell ice cream or whatever, and you're able to sell the ice cream at a price larger than it's costing you to obtain and then pay somebody to stand there selling it. However, the proceeds from selling the ice cream are not large enough to pay for your rental of that spot. That would be a situation where you'd produce in the short run, even though you're making a loss because you can't cover the rental spot, and then you'd exit in the long run. But the relevant decision for whether you keep operating is price bigger than average variable cost, right? Are you covering your ingredient costs? Are you making more by producing than you would be by shutting down? And the rationale would be, maybe you had this really optimistic forecast of like what you're going to be able to earn on the beach for the summer. So you buy this medallion to be able to operate, or you buy this location, you hire some high school student or something during the summer to stand there and sell ice cream. You're able to buy the ice cream, and whatever it is, like you're able to pay the hourly wage for the high school student, and you're able to pay you're able to sell the ice cream, turn around and sell it at a premium. And so every ice cream that you're selling and every hour that you have the person standing there, you're making revenue, positive revenue. You're covering your input costs, but you're not able to pay the large fixed sum that you needed to operate in the first place, maybe because of shutdowns on the beach. You can't sell enough ice cream. All right, fine. So what do? Well, you're going to keep operating because you're going to be able to make back more than you would have lost if you would have just shut down immediately, if you would have left immediately, exited immediately. But you're going to exit in the long run, meaning like if the next summer's like that, you're not going to operate. However, if the price is below average variable cost, right? Like if I buy the ice cream, like wholesale, whatever, for 25 cents a unit, and I can only sell it for 5 cents, right? That's bad. That's bad business. You want to shut down. Or if I'm hiring my high school student to sit there for $12 an hour, $15 an hour, wherever it's like minimum wage, but I'm not able to earn more than like $10 an hour worth of revenue in that hour, then I should also shut down, right? So if there's prices below average variable cost, shut down. All right, so break-even decision. What costs are relevant, what's not relevant? So the break-even point is where price is equal to average total cost. It's at the point where there's zero economic profit. Break-even price is the average avoidable cost per unit. And the break-even quantity is found by setting quantity equal to the fixed cost divided by the contribution margins, right? So Q is equal to fixed cost divided by markup, price minus marginal cost. Components of cost, so fixed, variable, unavoidable, and avoidable. So total costs are the sum of fixed and variable costs. Fixed costs are those that are invariant to changes in output. So it's your cost at zero output. It's like rent for your location on the beach or whatever. Variable cost changes with output. So each additional unit I sell is requiring more ingredients. That's going to incur variable costs. The short run means at least one factor is fixed. The long run means all costs are variable. Fixed costs are unavoidable in the short run. All costs are avoidable in the long run. Some variable costs are going to be avoidable and unavoidable, and some fixed costs are avoidable and unavoidable based on what time frame we're looking at. So avoidable means, can we drive this cost to zero? Can we not incur this cost, or have we already incurred them? Are we going to incur them either way? So, all right. So characteristics, differences, and implications of the four different markets. So the markets are perfect competition, monopoly, oligopoly, and monopolistic competition. In all cases, the firms want to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. For perfect competition, we further get where price equals marginal revenue because each additional unit is sold for exactly the same amount. So the marginal revenue of selling one more unit is just the market price. For all the other firms with market power, then marginal revenue equals marginal cost at a point where the price is actually going to be higher than marginal revenue. The key differentiating factor is barriers to entry, which allows then product differentiation. So the idea is like with perfect competition, you've got many buyers, many sellers, identical products, like perfectly identical, uniform products. Perfect information, no barriers to entry or exit. With monopoly, you have a single producer, strict barriers to entry. With oligopoly, you've got a collection of firms that each could have been a monopoly in their own right. He's typically thinking about a relatively uniform product, but there can be some degree of product differentiation. With monopolistic competition, you're thinking of many buyers and many sellers. You're thinking about product differentiation. You're thinking about no barriers to entry in the category, but there's barriers to entry for the specific product. Now, there can be a distinction here. Think of so I think about it in the Pittsburgh market where I lived for a while. Think about the grocery market. So the grocery market was an oligopoly, almost a monopoly, with Giant Eagle being the main grocer. But there's also a Whole Foods market. There's also like Aldi's or something. There's some other smaller grocery stores. So you think of the grocery store market between the firms being an oligopoly. You think of at the product level, they sell candy bars. That's there's monopolistic competition in the candy bar market, right? Or think about the local restaurant market. So if the local restaurant market or food trucks probably looks kind of like monopolistic competition. There's a lot of different food vendors, a lot of different local restaurants, a lot of product differentiation. And so amongst those, you might include fast food. But at the national level, there's an oligopoly between like McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, and like the fast food sellers that come to market. If we want to think outside of burgers, then KFC, Taco Bell, we think of them as in an oligopoly, but at the product level, there's monopolistic competition amongst the individual burgers. So there's this kind of, so the important thing is we have to define our market. You do this with the Porter's 5 forces analysis as well. You have to define the market, define the industry to be able to do the analysis. Otherwise, it seems like there's a lot of ambiguity. There's none once you've defined the market. But if you don't define the market or agree what we're talking about, now you can have an issue. All right, so the other thing is like, in practice, economists really like to think of these kind of along a spectrum of market power. So there's no market power for perfect competition. There's perfect market power for monopoly. There's less market power for monopoly than for oligopoly than monopoly, and then there's less market power than in monopolistic competition than in oligopoly. However, with monopolistic competition, you might have a monopoly over your small niche of consumers, and so that's interesting. Okay, so then behavioral economics, couple of concepts. Loss aversion is the idea that people treat losses as far worse than the equivalent foregone gains. So framing gets really important. That's important for advertising, for loyalty programs, for all different sorts of things for customers, because people like to avoid losses. So you want to think about it, is this a service fee? Is this a penalty? Is this a fine or a fee? How you frame it really matters. Myopia is a bias referring to focusing specifically on the present to the exclusion of other factors, right? So so you want to think about like what's becoming salient and what's relevant for decision making, and you want to think about you want to think of like all the relevant costs and benefits when making an economic decision. All right, price discrimination. Know the necessary requirements, characteristics, types. Necessary requirements is you've got to have market power, you've got to have the ability to block resale or arbitrage, and you have to have information about the willingness to pay of consumers, right? Direct price discrimination is offering prices targeted at specific individuals. This can be first-degree price discrimination, where you have personalized prices. Everybody pays their willingness to pay. Or it could be third-degree price discrimination, where there's a different price for each group. So this would be like adults and children, or locals versus visitors at Disneyland, something like that. And then the idea with third-degree price discrimination is you want to charge relative to the situation where you pool the segments of demand and set a price. The more inelastic demanders are going to pay more, and the more elastic demanders are going to pay a little bit less. They're going to get a little bit of a subsidy. And the idea is the more inelastic demanders, they're going to tolerate the relative price increase. Visitors who have come to the area, who are already there, are going to have more inelastic demand because they want to go to Disneyland or Legoland, whatever it is. And then locals could go kind of whenever. They're going to be way more price sensitive because they've got all the time in the world to go. I lived in Arizona for 8 years. I didn't go to the Grand Canyon until year 8, even though I was really eager to. I just always found something else to do. All right, so indirect price discrimination involves some element of self-selection. So this would be like second-degree price discrimination and hurdles or coupons. Second-degree price discrimination is where everyone faces the same menu of prices, and then they just choose which is best for them. So think about like Zoom pricing. You just go to Zoom real quick. You can look at their pricing. They've got the free account. They've got like the small business, and they've got the large organization account. So basically, like anybody can buy any of those accounts. You just buy the one that's right for you. And the pricing is geared to capture the surplus from the demanders with that particular set of needs. So that's second-degree price discrimination. Everyone faces the same set of prices. And then there's hurdles. This would be like coupons. You make something you have to kind of like go out of your way to be able to get the discount. So if there's a coupon for something or a discount code, you have to find it, you have to bother to enter it or bring it to the store or something like that. That's a hurdle. Or like hardcover versus paperback books. And so the hardcover book, paperback book, the cost difference is pennies, right? But they sell the hardcover immediately for those that are most urgently wanting to read the book, or buy it and then have it sit on their bookshelf and never read it, whatever. And so, but the hurdle is you could wait for the paperback release and then you get the discount. The hurdle is you have to wait. And so the idea is like everybody has the option, and then it's indirect price discrimination because they're self-selecting. You choose whether you buy now or wait. And then transfer pricing refers to the pricing policies between subsidiaries of a larger entity, sometimes used for tax avoidance, but of course regulators pay really close attention to this. So you want to think really carefully about the pricing differences between if you're producing something in-house, how much are you selling it for other related subsidiaries versus how much are you selling it for external customers, and the comparison of those prices really matters, especially from the perspective of legal issues and regulators. So you can justify price differences based on cost differences often, not exclusively, right? So consult a tax attorney and so on and so forth. But you have to pay really close attention to any price differences that are not substantially due to a compelling business reasoning. So let's see. Tax avoidance is perfectly legal. Tax evasion is highly illegal. However, what qualifies as tax avoidance in the United States might very well be considered tax evasion in the European Union and in other places. So you have to know your jurisdiction, you have to know where you are, and you have to pay very close attention, because something that can be perfectly legal in one area can be highly illegal in another, just based on how the tax code and how the laws are written. The last thing I just want to say is kind of like in that same note is that things we've been discussing, price discrimination, these things, the legality of these things depends very strongly, in some cases, on where you are. Are you doing business in China? Are you doing business in the European Union? Doing business in India, United States, Russia? All these things, the location matters. You have to know the local legal structure, and that's very important because you do not want to have your business, have your firm sort of run afoul of the local regulators, because there are substantial consequences if you do. So anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. I'm going to go ahead and conclude here.